February 1945, Montana. 22-year-old Annalisa Schmidt knelt in the snow outside Camp Stronghold, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Through the thin walls of the barracks behind her, she could hear the other women whispering in German, their voices tight with fear. The wind had picked up in the last hour, carrying with it the smell of the coming storm. Ice crystals stung her face. Her fingers wrapped in threadbare gloves had lost feeling an hour ago. She stared at the darkening sky and thought about death. Not the quick death of a bullet, not the violent death of a bombing raid, but the slow death she had been promised since the day of her capture. The death that Nazi propaganda had warned her about every single day of her life. The death that came when Americans showed their true nature. They will leave you to freeze, her training instructor had said. They will march you into the wilderness and abandon you. That is what barbarians do. Annalise had believed it then. Standing here now, watching American guards gather in urgent clusters near the command building, she believed it still. The blizzard was coming, and she was certain she would die in it. What she could not know, kneeling there in the Montana cold, was that the next 72 hours would shatter every single thing she had ever been taught. That American soldiers would carry her through hell itself. That one man's simple act of kindness would reveal a truth so powerful it would define the rest of her life. This is the story of 87 German women who expected cruelty and found humanity instead. This is the story of American soldiers who chose compassion when hate would have been easier. This is the story of how propaganda dies the moment you look into the eyes of someone carrying you through a blizzard. This is the story of the day Annalisa Schmidt learned what America really means. Camp Stronghold sat 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by Montana wilderness that stretched endlessly in all directions. The facility had been constructed hastily in 1943 to house German prisoners of war captured in North Africa. Nobody had expected it would need to hold women. Nobody had expected those women would have to survive a Montana winter. The barracks were temporary structures, wooden frames with thin walls that did nothing to stop the cold. Broken windows had been stuffed with newspaper. The heating system, designed for moderate use, struggled constantly and failed often. At night, frost formed on the inside of the walls. The women could see their breath even under their thin blankets. 87 women, ages 19 to 34, all of them Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signal auxiliaries for the German Wehrmacht. They had operated radios, transmitted coded messages, kept German military communications running. They were not combat soldiers, but they were essential to the German war machine. Essential enough that when American forces overran their positions in Normandy, they were taken prisoner rather than released. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of crossing the Atlantic in the hold of a transport ship. 6 months of processing through military bureaucracy. 6 months of wondering when the cruelty would begin. Because that is what they had been taught to expect. The daily ration at Camp Stronghold was 450 calories. Before the war, a working woman needed 2,000. Now their bodies consumed themselves just to maintain core temperature. Annalise could count her ribs. Her hip bones jutted sharp beneath her thinning skin. When she looked at her reflection in a piece of broken mirror, she barely recognized the hollow-faced stranger staring back. The cold was worse than the hunger. Montana in February was a different kind of cold than Hamburg in winter. This cold had teeth. It bit through every layer of clothing. It turned flesh brittle. At night, the women huddled together on the floor, combining body heat, sharing the few blankets the Americans had provided. 150 American soldiers guarded the camp. Most were young, too young to have seen real combat. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit. Ranch hands from Texas and shopkeepers' sons from New England. They had been assigned to Camp Stronghold because they were deemed unsuitable for frontline duty. Too young, too inexperienced, or in some cases recovering from wounds. The camp commander was Major William Thornton, 45 years old, a veteran of the First World War who had been pulled from retirement when this war began. He had lost his son at Anzio. Anthony Thornton, 21 years old, killed by German artillery. The loss had carved something deep out of Major Thornton's soul, but it had not made him cruel. If anything, it had made him more determined to remember why they were fighting. Not to destroy Germany, not to kill Germans, but to defend the idea that every human life has dignity. Lieutenant Frank Morrison was second in command, 32 years old, stern-faced and hard-eyed. He had lost his brother at Normandy, cut down by German machine gun fire. Morrison believed in duty and discipline. He followed orders without question. But there was a hardness in him, a kernel of bitterness that made some of the guards nervous. Sergeant Bobby Martinez was the camp medic, 29 years old, Mexican-American from New Mexico. He had gentle hands and a kind face, though he rarely smiled anymore. He had seen too many boys die, had written too many letters to mothers and wives. The medical station at Camp Stronghold was inadequate, supplies limited, but Martinez did what he could with what he had. And then there was Corporal James Sullivan, 24 years old. Everyone called him Jimmy, Irish-American from Boston with red hair and freckles and a quick smile that made him look younger than his years. He had a sister back home named Mary, 22 years old, same as Annalise, though neither of them knew that yet. Mary worked in a factory making radios for the war effort. Every week, Sullivan wrote her letters about Montana, about the mountains, about anything except the prisoners he was guarding. Because thinking about the prisoners made Sullivan think about his brother Danny. And thinking about Danny made his chest tight and his hands shake. Danny Sullivan had died at Normandy, killed by German machine gun fire while storming Omaha Beach. Sullivan had gotten the telegram 3 days later, had been the one to tell his mother, had held her while she screamed and wept and cursed God and Germany and the entire world. When they told Sullivan he would be guarding German prisoners, part of him had been angry. Part of him had wanted to hate them all, wanted to see them as the enemy who killed his brother. But Major Thornton had told him something that stuck. Your brother died fighting for the idea that all human life matters, even enemy life. Don't dishonor his sacrifice by forgetting that. So Sullivan tried to see the prisoners as people rather than enemies. Tried to remember they had families too, mothers who loved them, lives that mattered. It was hard, but he tried. Among the 87 German women, certain individuals stood out. Annalise Schmidt, 22 years old, from Hamburg. She had joined the Nachrichtentruppe in 1942 when she was 19. Her older brother Klaus had died on the Eastern Front the year before. Her father told her it was her duty to serve, that the Reich needed every German. She had believed it. Believed in the cause, believed in the propaganda, believed she was serving something greater than herself. She had been a good radio operator, fast, accurate, able to work under pressure. She took pride in her work, in being useful and contributing to what she thought was Germany's survival. Then came Normandy, the Allied invasion, the German forces collapsing in retreat, officers abandoning their positions, leaving the signal corps behind, American soldiers appearing suddenly, rifles raised, shouting in English. Surrender had been the only option, and in that moment, waiting for bullets or bayonets, Annalise had been certain her life was over. Instead, an American medic had given her water, had bandaged a cut on her arm, had spoken gently even though she could not understand his words. It confused her, made her question what she had been taught, but only briefly, because the propaganda voice in her head whispered, "This is a trick. The cruelty comes later. They want you compliant now. The real horror waits." 6 months later, sitting in Montana cold, Annalise still heard that voice, still believed the cruelty was waiting. Her closest friend in the camp was Liesel Klein, 21 years old, from a small village near Munich. Liesel had frostbite on both feet from the long march before their capture. The toes on her left foot had turned black. Sergeant Martinez had done what he could, but without proper antibiotics, without adequate heating, the frostbite was getting worse. Liesel tried not to complain, but Annalise could see the pain in her eyes, could hear the way her breath caught when she tried to walk. At night, Liesel would whisper, "I think I will lose the foot," and Annalise would hold her hand and say, "No, you will be fine. We will go home, and you will dance at your wedding." Neither of them believed it. Then there was Margaret Hoffman. Everyone called her Greta. 19 years old, the youngest of the prisoners. She still had baby fat in her cheeks, still looked like she should be in school rather than a prisoner of war camp. Greta cried often, cried for her mother, for her village, for the life she thought she would have. The other women protected her, mothered her, tried to shield her from the worst of the cold and hunger. Greta believed the propaganda completely. When the other women sometimes questioned, sometimes wondered if maybe the Americans were not as terrible as they had been told, Greta would shake her head fiercely. "They are waiting," she would insist, "waiting for the right moment. Then we will see their true faces." Frieda Weber was 34, the oldest of the prisoners. Before the war, she had been a school teacher in Berlin. She was educated, thoughtful, quietly skeptical of everything she heard. She had joined the Nachrichtentruppe not out of belief but out of survival. It was serve or be sent to a labor camp. She had chosen service. Frida said little, but she watched everything. Watched how the American guards behaved. Watched how Major Thornton ran the camp. And slowly, carefully, she began to question everything she had been taught. But she kept those questions to herself, because questioning out loud felt dangerous even here. Helga Schneider was 28. Before the war, she had been a farmer's daughter, strong and practical, and unafraid of hard work. She had broad shoulders and calloused hands and a protective instinct toward the younger women. When guards got too close, Helga would position herself between them and the others. When food was short, Helga would give her portion to Greta. When the cold was unbearable, Helga would gather the women together and tell them stories of her village, of summer harvests and warm bread and sunshine. These women, these 87 individuals with names and histories and families and dreams, they were about to experience something that would change them forever. But first they had to survive what was coming. The memories came to Anneliese without warning, vivid and sharp. Hamburg, 1942. The training facility where the Reich prepared its signal auxiliaries. The building was cold, the beds hard, the instructors harsh. But Anneliese had been determined to succeed. For Klaus, she told herself. For Germany. The propaganda was everywhere. Posters on every wall showing American soldiers as savage beasts with twisted faces and grasping hands. The text beneath read, "This is your enemy. They show no mercy. They have no honor. Surrender means death." Every morning began with a lecture. The instructors would stand at the front of the room and describe in vivid detail what Americans did to capture Germans. They raped the women, the instructor said, tortured them for information, then killed them slowly, left their bodies in ditches for the rats. "Do you understand?" the instructor would shout. "Do you understand what awaits you if you are captured?" "Yes," the young women would respond. "We understand." "Good. Then you will fight. You will serve. You will never surrender. Because death in battle is better than what the enemy will do to you." Anneliese had absorbed these words like poison, had let them shape her understanding of the world, had never questioned whether they might be lies. Because everyone said the same thing. The posters, the instructors, the radio broadcasts, the newspapers. Every voice in Germany spoke with one message: the enemy is inhuman. The enemy will destroy you. Trust only the Reich. When you hear the same lie 1,000 times, it starts to sound like truth. Another memory, Normandy, August 1944. The chaos of retreat, German forces falling back in disorder, supply lines, broken communications failing. Anneliese and her unit had been operating a field radio station trying to maintain contact with the command when American forces appeared. Her commanding officer, a lieutenant whose name she had already forgotten, had gathered the women together for final orders. "If they capture you," he said, his face pale with fear or exhaustion, "or both, you know what will happen. Better to die here. Better to die fighting." He pulled out his sidearm as if to make a point. But then the sound of American voices shouting in English, the crash of equipment being overturned, the thunder of boots on ground. The lieutenant ran, just turned and ran, leaving his sidearm on the ground, leaving the women staring at each other in shock. And then the Americans were there. Young soldiers, barely older than Anneliese, rifles raised but not firing. One of them shouting something in English. Another making calm down gestures with his hands. A medic came forward. He had a kind face and gentle movements. He saw the cut on Anneliese's arm torn open when she had fallen during the retreat. Without hesitation, he opened his medical kit and bandaged the wound, gave her water from his canteen, spoke softly even though she understood nothing. This confused Anneliese, challenged what she knew. But the propaganda voice in her head explained it away. This is temporary. This is how they make you compliant. The real cruelty comes later. Even now, 6 months later, she sometimes heard that voice, especially at night when the cold was worst and fear lived closest to the surface. Present day, Camp Stronghold, February 8, 1945. Anneliese sat on her bunk, such as it was, just a thin mattress on a wooden frame. Around her, the other women were going through their evening routines, washing faces with cold water, braiding hair, mending torn clothing, speaking in low voices about nothing important because speaking about important things led to tears. Liesel sat beside her, examining her frostbitten foot. The toes were worse today, 3 of them completely black, now the tissue dead. Liesel touched them gently and felt nothing. I will lose them, Liesel said quietly. The foot, maybe. Annalisa started to offer false comfort, then stopped. They were past the point of lies. I know, she said instead. I am sorry. Liesel nodded. At least I will live. Yes. At least I will go home someday. Yes, Annalise agreed, though she was not certain of even that. Young Greta was crying again. Soft sobs muffled against her pillow. Helga sat with her one strong arm around the girl's shoulders, whispering reassurance. It is all right, little one. Be strong. We are together. Frida stood near the broken window, looking out at the darkening sky. The wind is picking up, she observed. There is a storm coming. There is always a storm coming, Helga replied, but her voice was gentle. And then, cutting through the evening quiet, the sound of boots on frozen ground. American voices shouting, engines starting, the unmistakable urgency of something happening. The women froze, looked at each other. Fear flickered across every face. What is it? Greta whispered. I do not know, Annalisa said, but her stomach tightened with dread. In the command building, Major Thornton held a weather report in his hands. The paper trembled slightly, though whether from the cold or from what it contained, he could not say. Lieutenant Morrison stood across the desk. Sergeant Martinez waited by the door. Corporal Sullivan shifted his weight from foot to foot, nervous energy radiating from him. Gentleman, Thornton said, his voice measured and calm. We have a situation, he read from the report. Massive blizzard system tracking southeast. Expected arrival in 6 hours. Temperature dropped to -35 with wind chill. Sustained wind speeds over 60 miles per hour. Whiteout conditions. Duration estimated at 48 to 72 hours. Thornton set the paper down. These barracks will not survive that storm. We have already had structural damage from smaller weather events. This will tear them apart. What are our options? Sir Martinez asked. There is a reinforced facility, 8 miles north, Thornton said. Old mining supply depot, built to withstand harsh conditions. If we can get there before the worst of the storm hits, we can ride it out safely. 8 miles, Morrison repeated, through what will become a death trap, and we have 87 prisoners to transport. The room was silent, everyone understanding what Morrison was implying without saying it directly. The trucks, Sullivan said. Can we use the trucks? Already checked, Martinez replied. We have 3 functional vehicles, not enough capacity for everyone, and the roads are already compromised. Snow depth is increasing rapidly. More silence, the weight of the decision pressing down. Then Morrison spoke carefully, choosing his words. Sir, with respect, we need to prioritize our own men. The prisoners are enemy combatants. If we cannot transport everyone safely, we need to secure the American soldiers first. Thornton looked at his second-in-command for a long moment. Morrison was not wrong about the technical military protocol. Prisoners of war were a secondary concern to the safety of American forces. But protocol and morality were not always the same thing. Lieutenant Thornton said quietly, I lost my son at Anzio. Anthony was 21 years old. He believed he was fighting for something that mattered, for the idea that all human life has value, that dignity is not determined by nationality. Morrison said nothing. I will not dishonor my son's sacrifice. Thornton continued by treating these women as expendable. They are prisoners, yes, but they are human beings. And if we leave them to die because it is inconvenient to save them, then we become what we are fighting against. He stood up, his decision made. We evacuate everyone, all personnel, all prisoners. We leave no one behind. That is not a request, Lieutenant. That is an order. Yes, sir, Morrison said, though his jaw was tight. Sullivan felt something loosen in his chest, something he had not realized was wound tight. This was why he followed Major Thornton. This was what America was supposed to mean. Sergeant Martinez, Thornton said, organize the men. We need teams for transport. The weakest prisoners will need to be carried. The strongest can walk with assistance. We leave in 3 hours before the worst of the storm arrives. Martinez nodded. Yes, sir. Corporal Sullivan, you will assist in preparing the prisoners. Explain the situation as best you can. Keep them calm. Sullivan swallowed. His German was terrible, but he would try. Yes, sir. As the officers filed out to begin preparations, Thornton stood alone in his office for a moment. He thought about Anthony, about the last letter his son had sent home, about the words that had stayed with him. Dad, Anthony had written, I am scared every day. But I am trying to remember why we are here. We are not here to destroy people. We are here to protect the idea that people matter. All people. Even enemies. Especially enemies. Because if we lose that, we lose everything worth fighting for. Thornton folded that memory carefully, placed it back in the corner of his heart where he kept it safe. Then he put on his heavy coat and went out into the cold to save 87 lives. The guards came to the women's barracks as darkness fell. The door opened with a bang, letting in a gust of freezing wind. Several American soldiers entered, led by Corporal Sullivan. The women scrambled to their feet, fear immediate and visceral. This was it. Whatever they had been waiting for, it was happening now. Sullivan raised his hands in a calming gesture. He spoke in slow, careful English, then tried his broken German. Großer Sturm kommt. Big storm. Very bad. Wir müssen gehen. Must go. Safe place. Verstehen. Understand. The women stared at him, some comprehending the words but not believing them, others not understanding at all. Annalisa stepped forward, her heart hammering. She had learned some English before the war. Safe place, she said, her accent thick. Where Sullivan pointed north. Building. Strong building. 8 kilometers. We go now, before storm. The women began speaking over each other in German. Panic spreading like fire. This is it, Greta was saying, her voice high and frightened. This is what they promised. They will march us into the blizzard and leave us. No, Frida said, though she sounded uncertain. If they wanted to kill us, why tell us anything? Why not just leave us here when the storm comes? It is a trick, Helga insisted, to make us walk willingly, easier than forcing us. Annalisa felt torn between hope and fear. What Sullivan was saying made sense if it was true. But how could they know it was true, please, Sullivan said, seeing their fear and not understanding all the words but understanding the emotion. Please, storm very bad. Building very strong. You will be safe. I promise. Greta laughed, bitter and disbelieving. He promises, the American promises, as if promises mean anything. But there was no choice. When soldiers tell you to move, you move. Whether it leads to safety or death, you move. The women began gathering their meager possessions. Thin blankets, spare clothing, small personal items that had survived the journey from Europe. Annalise found Liesel struggling to stand. Her frostbitten foot could not bear weight. How will I walk 8 kilometers, Liesel whispered. I do not know, Annalise admitted, but we will find a way. Outside chaos organized itself into purpose. American soldiers were loading supplies into trucks, checking equipment, shouting orders. The wind was noticeably stronger now, carrying the smell of the coming storm. And then something happened that made no sense. Sergeant Martinez approached with an armful of heavy wool blankets. American military issue. He started handing them out to the German prisoners. Here, he said, draping one around an older woman's shoulders. You need this. Going to be cold. Annalise stared as American soldiers moved through the group of prisoners distributing supplies. Extra blankets, wool coats, gloves, food rations. Corporal Sullivan walked up to Annalise carrying his own personal coat. Heavy, warm military issue. He held it out to her. You, he said, pointing to her thin jacket. You need. Very cold. Annalise did not move. Stared at the coat like it might be a weapon. Sullivan smiled gently, sadly, and placed the coat around her shoulders anyway. It was heavy, warm, still carrying his body heat. For you, he said, I am okay. Annalise felt the weight of that coat and her mind spun. Why? Why would they give us their things? Why share their supplies if they plan to abandon us? Around her, other women were asking the same question. Margaret whispered, maybe to make us compliant, to make us walk willingly, but that made no sense either. These were supplies the Americans needed, real valuable supplies being freely given. Frida caught Annalise's eye. Look at their faces, she said quietly. This does not look like cruelty waiting to happen. But Annalise was still afraid, still expecting the trap to spring. Near the trucks, a different crisis was unfolding. Sir, a young private was reporting to Major Thornton the vehicles are stuck. Snow is already 2 feet deep on the access road and accumulating fast. The engines are having trouble in this cold, and even if we get them started, I do not think they can make it through. Thornton looked at the trucks, looked at the road already disappearing under white, looked at the sky, dark and threatening. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at his elbow. Sir, we need to abort. Secure what we can here. Ride out the storm. These barracks will collapse, Thornton said. Then we secure the stronger buildings. The command post, the storage depot. Move our men there. The prisoners. Morrison did not finish the sentence. Did not need to. Thornton looked at the prisoners huddled together in borrowed American coats, fear etched on every face. Looked at his soldiers, young men waiting for orders. The choice crystallized, sharp and clear and unavoidable. No, Thornton said. We are not leaving them. We are not securing some and abandoning others. We evacuate everyone. Sir Morrison said, frustration breaking through his professional demeanor. We cannot carry 87 women 8 miles through a blizzard. That is suicide. For our men. Thornton was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Sergeant Martinez. Sergeant, organize carry teams. Every able-bodied man will assist in transporting prisoners who cannot walk. We will use a rotation system to prevent exhaustion. Strongest prisoners walk with support. Weakest get carried. Martinez blinked. Carried, sir. Carried, Thornton confirmed. On backs if necessary. However we can manage. We leave in 1 hour. Morrison opened his mouth to protest again. Thornton cut him off with a look. That is final, Lieutenant. We leave no one behind. Sullivan heard the orders and felt something like awe. They were really going to do this. Really going to carry enemy prisoners through a death storm. Because it was the right thing to do. The soldiers began organizing, pairing up, planning rotations, distributing weight. Young men from farms and factories and small towns preparing to risk their lives for women whose country was trying to kill Americans. And the German women watched this preparation with growing confusion, with mounting hope and persistent fear, with minds struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. Annalise pulled Sullivan's coat tighter around herself. It smelled like him, like soap and wool, and something indefinably human. She looked at the American soldiers preparing to carry her and her companions. And for the first time since her capture, for the first time since Normandy, for the first time since the propaganda had filled her head with lies, Annalise allowed herself to consider a dangerous thought. What if everything they told us was wrong? But that thought was too big, too frightening. She pushed it away, focused instead on survival. On the next hour, the next step, the next breath, the blizzard was coming. And whatever waited in that storm, truth or lie, mercy or cruelty, would reveal itself soon enough. The moment came without ceremony. Corporal Sullivan approached the group of German women standing near the barracks entrance. His breath came out in visible clouds. Snow had already begun to fall, small flakes that caught the light from the compound lamps and turned the air into something luminous and cold. Behind him, other American soldiers were doing the same, walking toward clusters of prisoners. Their movements deliberate, careful, as if approaching frightened animals. Sullivan stopped in front of Annalise. Their eyes met. His were kind, tired, uncertain. Hers were wide with fear and confusion. He held out his hands, palms up, a gesture of offering. Then he spoke in slow English, supplemented with broken German. You, he said, pointing to her, then pointing to himself, I carry. Verstehen? He turned around, bent his knees slightly, pointed to his back. The universal sign. Climb on. I will carry you. Annalisa stared at his back like it was a puzzle she could not solve. Her mind raced through possibilities. This is a trick. This is humiliation. This is something terrible disguised as kindness. But Sullivan just waited, patient. His back turned to her, making himself vulnerable, offering himself as transportation through a killing storm. Around her, other American soldiers were doing the same thing, bending down, turning their backs, gesturing to the weakest prisoners. Come on, we will carry you. Private Chen approached Liesel, whose frostbitten foot made walking impossible. Chen was small, not much bigger than Liesel herself, but he positioned himself in front of her and gestured. Please, I help. Liesel looked at Annalise with terror in her eyes. What do? I do not know, Annalise whispered back. Sergeant Martinez moved through the group, explaining in English that was translated haltingly by those few women who understood fragments. The storm is too dangerous. Some of you cannot walk the distance. We will carry those who need it. Others will walk with support. We rotate every 15 minutes so no one is overburdened. Helga, strong and suspicious, spoke up in German. Why would you do this for us? Martinez did not understand the words, but he understood the question in her tone. He thought for a moment, then spoke slowly. Because it is right thing, because you are human. That was all. No grand speeches, no manipulation. Just a simple statement of human decency. And slowly, hesitantly, with fear still coiling in their stomachs, the women began to accept help. Liesel carefully positioned herself on Private Chen's back. He stood adjusting to her weight, testing his balance. Okay, he said, though she did not understand. Okay, I got you. Other women were being lifted onto other backs. Margaret, barely 19 and weak from malnutrition, climbed onto a soldier's back and immediately began crying. The soldier, a farm boy from Wisconsin, just patted her leg gently and said, "It is all right. You are safe." Annalise was the last to move. Sullivan still weighted his back to her snow, collecting on his shoulders. She took a step forward, hesitated, took another step. Sullivan felt her movement and spoke without turning around. "It is okay. I am strong. You are not too heavy." Annalise placed her hands on his shoulders, felt the solid warmth of him through the fabric, felt him living and breathing and real. She climbed onto his back. Sullivan's hands came up to support her legs. His grip was firm but gentle. He stood slowly adjusting to her weight, and Annalise was shocked by how light she must feel to him. Months of starvation had left her weighing almost nothing. "Ready?" Sullivan asked. She did not answer, could not answer. Her throat was too tight. Sullivan took that as confirmation and began walking. The journey into hell had begun. The first hour was a descent into a frozen nightmare. The temperature had already dropped to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind, which had been strong when they left, now gusted to 40 miles per hour. Snow fell so thick it was like walking through a white curtain that never opened. The group moved in a column, Major Thornton at the front using a compass and his memory of the terrain to navigate. Lieutenant Morrison at the rear making sure no one fell behind. In between, a line of American soldiers and German prisoners struggling forward through deepening snow. Those who could walk were supported on both sides by American soldiers. Arms linked, moving together, three people becoming one unit of forward momentum. Every step was a battle. The snow was already knee-deep in places, the drifts even deeper. Those who could not walk were carried. Piggyback style, the soldiers bent forward against the wind, their passengers clinging to shoulders and necks, faces pressed against backs, for warmth and protection from the stinging snow. Annalise, riding on Sullivan's back, felt every step he took, felt his legs pushing through the snow, felt his breathing become labored, felt the strain in his shoulders as he bent against the wind. She wanted to tell him to put her down, wanted to say she could walk, but she knew it was not true. Her legs had barely carried her from the barracks to the assembly point. They would never carry her 8 kilometers through this. So she held on, and felt guilt mixing with fear, mixing with something she could not name. Around her she could hear the sounds of struggle, men breathing hard, women crying softly, the wind howling like something alive and hungry, the crunch of boots in snow, the occasional shout as someone stumbled or slipped. After 15 minutes, a voice called out over the wind, "Switch time." Annalise felt Sullivan's relief as he carefully lowered her to the ground. But before she could even process what was happening, another soldier was there. A different face, equally young, equally determined. The soldier bent down and Annalisa climbed onto a new back. Sullivan stood to the side, breathing hard, shaking out his shoulders. But he did not rest long. Almost immediately, he moved to take over, carrying another woman whose previous carrier needed a break. They were rotating, sharing the burden systematically, making sure no single man collapsed from exhaustion. Annalise watched this organization, this cooperation, and felt her certainty cracking. This was not the behavior of men planning to abandon them. This was the behavior of men determined to save them. But the propaganda voice in her head still whispered, "Wait, the cruelty comes later. They want you tired and compliant first." The rotation continued every 15 minutes like clockwork. Sullivan would carry Annalise for 15 minutes, then someone else would take over. Then another. Then Sullivan again. During the moments when she walked beside him, instead of riding on his back, Sullivan would talk. His English was too fast for her to catch everything, but she caught fragments. "Doing okay, cold, hang in there. Not much farther." Lies, probably. They had only been walking an hour. They had 7 more kilometers to go. It was very much farther, but his voice was kind. That much she understood regardless of language. Hour 2 brought the first crisis. The storm had intensified, wind speeds over 50 miles per hour, temperature dropping toward -20, visibility down to barely 10 feet. The world had become nothing but white and cold, and the endless struggle to move forward. Annalise was back on Sullivan's back when Sergeant Martinez's voice cut through the wind. Medical emergency. Stop the line. The column halted. Sullivan carefully lowered Annalise and moved forward to see what was happening. She followed, driven by curiosity and concern. Liesel had collapsed. Private Chen had been carrying her when he felt her go limp. Now she lay in the snow, conscious but barely responsive. Her lips were blue. Her skin was pale gray. Martinez knelt beside her, checking her pulse, her pupils, her breathing. Severe hypothermia, he said. We need to warm her core temperature now, or we will lose her. Lieutenant Morrison pushed forward through the group. His face was hard. Sergeant, we need to keep moving. The storm is getting worse. If we stop too long, everyone is at risk. This woman will die if we do not treat her, Martinez said firmly. Morrison's jaw clenched. She is a prisoner, an enemy combatant. We have limited medical supplies. We need to preserve them for our own men. The soldiers around them went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for what would happen next. Major Thornton appeared, his face red from cold and wind. What is the situation? Martinez explained quickly. Liesel's hypothermia, the need for immediate treatment. The limited supplies, Morrison added. Sir, we cannot risk our men's lives and supplies for every prisoner who falters. We need to make hard choices. Thornton looked at Liesel, at her blue lips and gray skin, at Annalise kneeling beside her friend, terror in her eyes, at the circle of soldiers and prisoners watching to see what America really meant when the cost was high. The silence stretched. Snow continued to fall. Then Thornton spoke. Sergeant Martinez, treat her. Use whatever supplies you need. Sir Morrison started. That is an order, Lieutenant Thornton said. His voice was not loud, but it carried absolute authority. We do not leave people behind. We do not decide some lives matter less than others. Not ever. That is not who we are. Martinez immediately opened his medical pack. He pulled out a small glass vial. Morphine. Precious rare, meant for the most serious emergencies. He injected it into Liesel's arm. The painkiller would help her body relax, would help her core temperature stabilize. Then he wrapped her in 2 thermal blankets from his pack and instructed Private Chen to hold her close, share body heat. The whole group watched this. American soldiers watching their medic use precious supplies on a German prisoner. German women watching the enemy save one of their own when abandoning her would have been easier. Annalise felt something crack deep inside her chest. Something she had been holding tight since Normandy, since her capture, since the moment American soldiers first showed her kindness. She did not understand. These men were not pretending. This was not a trick. They were genuinely, actually, impossibly trying to save German lives at cost to themselves. The propaganda had been wrong. 10 minutes later, with Liesel stabilized and the morphine taking effect, the group resumed walking. Chen carried her with renewed determination, as if the act of saving her had made her his personal responsibility. Annalisa climbed back onto Sullivan's back. This time, when her arms went around his shoulders, when her weight settled onto him, she felt different. Not grateful yet, not trusting, but less afraid and more confused than ever. The third hour brought a different kind of crisis. Sullivan had been carrying Annalise for 40 minutes straight. He had refused the rotation twice, waving off other soldiers who offered to take over. Just a bit more, he kept saying. I can make it a bit more. But his legs were shaking now. His breathing was ragged. Sweat froze on his face despite the killing cold. Annalise could feel his exhaustion, could feel every tremor in his muscles, every stumble in his step. She leaned close to his ear and spoke in her broken English. Jimmy, stop. I walk now, you tired? Sullivan shook his head. Not yet. Almost there. But it was not almost there. They were maybe halfway. 4 kilometers left. An eternity in this storm. No, Annalise insisted. Please. You put me down. Sullivan turned his head slightly so she could see his profile. When he spoke, his voice was gentle despite the exhaustion. My sister is your age, 22, back in Boston. Her name is Mary. Annalise went still. Why was he telling her this now? If Mary was stuck in a blizzard in Germany, Sullivan continued, his words coming in gasps between breaths. I would hope someone would carry her. Would hope someone would see her as a person. not as an enemy, just as someone who needs help. He paused, catching his breath, then finished. So I am carrying you, because you remind me of her, and because it is the right thing to do. The words hit Annalise like a physical blow. He was not carrying her because of orders, not because of duty, not because of some abstract principle. He was carrying her because he had a sister who was 22 years old, and he saw that sister in Annalise, saw the humanity, saw the person beneath the uniform and nationality. Tears froze on Annalise's face. Her whole body shook, and it was not from the cold. Everything she had been taught was a lie. Every propaganda poster showing Americans as monsters. Every radio broadcast describing Allied cruelty. Every instructor warning that surrender meant torture and death. All lies. Because here was James Sullivan, exhausted beyond measure, risking hypothermia and frostbite, carrying an enemy soldier through hell because she reminded him of his sister. Annalisa pressed her face against his shoulder and wept. Great shuddering sobs that made her whole body convulse. Sullivan felt it and must have thought she was just cold because he murmured, "Hang on, stay strong, we will get there." But she was not crying from cold. She was crying because her entire worldview was shattering. If they lied about Americans being monsters, what else did they lie about? If they lied about the enemy being inhuman, what else was false? The questions flooded her mind. Did they lie about why the war started? Did they lie about who the real enemies were? Did they lie about everything? She thought about her brother Klaus dead on the Eastern Front. Had he died for lies, for a regime that saw German lives as expendable? For leaders who cared nothing about the people they sent to die? She thought about the past 2 years of her life, working for the Wehrmacht, transmitting their messages, helping their war machine function. Had she been serving Germany or serving the people who destroyed Germany? The propaganda voice in her head, the one that had whispered warnings and suspicions for so long, finally went silent, because it had nothing left to say, because the evidence before her eyes was undeniable. These American soldiers were good men, not because they were perfect, not because they had no prejudice or anger, but because when it mattered most, when it would have been easier to be cruel, they chose kindness instead. That was the truth. Everything else had been lies. Sullivan stumbled, his leg gave out, and he fell to one knee. Annalise tumbled off his back into the snow. Several soldiers rushed over. "You okay, Sullivan?" Sullivan tried to stand, and his legs would not obey. Too long carrying weight, too much exhaustion. His body had reached its limit. "I am sorry," he gasped. "I am sorry. I can keep going. Just need a minute." Martinez was there immediately. "Sullivan, you are done. You need rest." "No," Sullivan protested. "She needs—" "Another soldier will take her," Martinez said firmly. "You rest. That is an order." Sullivan looked at Annalisa sitting in the snow beside him. "I am sorry," he said again. Annalisa did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She reached out and took his hand, squeezed it. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "Thank you for sister. Thank you for Carrie." Sullivan's eyes went wide. Then he smiled through his exhaustion. "You are welcome." Another soldier helped Annalise to her feet and positioned himself for her to climb onto his back. But as they moved away, she kept looking back at Sullivan, at this young man who had carried her for over an hour because she reminded him of his sister, at this enemy who had shown her what humanity really meant. The fourth hour brought complete chaos. The storm reached its full fury, wind speeds over 60 miles per hour, temperature -25, complete whiteout conditions, visibility 0. The world had become nothing but howling white death. Major Thornton stopped the column, used his flashlight, but could barely see it himself. The beam disappeared into swirling snow after just a few feet. "We have lost the trail," Thornton shouted over the wind. "Cannot see the landmarks. Need to get bearings." Around him, people were collapsing. American soldiers dropping to their knees from exhaustion. German prisoners unconscious from hypothermia. The rotation system was breaking down because everyone was too tired to carry anyone. Martinez moved through the chaos, checking pulses, trying to keep people alive with increasingly limited supplies. 2 American soldiers down with severe hypothermia. 3 more German women unconscious, including young Margaret. Major Martinez shouted, "I am losing people. Need to get them warm now or they will die." Lieutenant Morrison appeared at Thornton's side, his face invisible in the storm except for eyes reflecting flashlight beams. "Sir, we need shelter immediately." We cannot stay exposed like this, I know Thornton said, but where we are lost. Cannot see the depot. Cannot even see 10 feet. Then we dig in, Morrison said. Snow caves, something, anything. Thornton looked around at his people, at American soldiers and German prisoners collapsed together in the snow, no longer maintaining any distinction between captor and captive. Just humans at the absolute limit of endurance. This was the moment, the crisis point, the moment when giving up would make sense. When the smart decision would be to save who you could and accept the losses. Major Thornton had not survived the First World War and 27 years of military service by giving up when things looked impossible. He turned to the strongest remaining soldiers, you, and you, spread out in a 50-foot perimeter. Look for any sign of the depot. Anything, a wall, a roof line, anything. Sir Morrison said we will lose them in the storm. Then they stay in sight of each other and within shouting distance. But we need to find that building or we are all dead. The soldiers moved out immediately, becoming ghostly shapes in the swirling white, then disappearing completely. Annalise huddled with the other women in a tight cluster. They had all been taught to hate each other based on nationality, Germans versus Americans. But now pressed together for warmth, trying to survive together, those labels meant nothing. Helga held Margaret's unconscious body. Frida wrapped her arms around two younger women. Annalise found herself next to an American soldier she did not know, both of them sharing body heat without thinking about it. The propaganda voice in her head was dead, murdered by reality, by proof that people were just people when the labels fell away. Minutes passed, felt like hours. The cold was unbearable. Annalisa could no longer feel her feet. Her hands were useless, clumsy chunks at the end of her arms. We are going to die here, someone said. German or American? Annalise could not tell. The voice was just human, just afraid. Then a shout, distant, almost lost in the wind. I see it. The voice was young, cracking with desperate hope. I see the depot, 100 yards northwest. The effect was electric. People who had been ready to give up found reserves of strength they did not know existed. Soldiers helped prisoners to their feet. Prisoners helped soldiers stand. Everyone helping everyone, because survival was not American or German. It was human. Sullivan appeared beside Annalise. He had rested for 20 minutes and insisted on carrying again. His face was red from cold and wind, but his eyes were determined. Annie, he said, last push. We are almost there. Let me carry you. This time Annalise did not hesitate, did not question. She climbed onto his back and held on tight. The final 100 yards took 20 minutes. Every foot was a battle. Snow waist deep, wind trying to tear them apart. Bodies at the absolute edge of what they could endure. But they pushed forward, step by impossible step. Sullivan carried Annalise. His legs shook with every step. His breathing was ragged and desperate, but he did not stop, did not slow, just kept moving forward because that was the only option. You are too heavy, Annalise said into his ear, trying to give him an excuse to put her down. Not true, Sullivan gasped back. You are light, almost there. Just hold on. And finally, impossibly miraculously, a wall appeared in the white, then a door, then soldiers pulling it open. One by one, people stumbled inside, into blessed warmth, into shelter from the killing wind, into salvation. Sullivan carried Annalise through the threshold. 3 steps into the depot, his legs gave out completely. He collapsed Annalise still on his back. She rolled off him, terrified. Jimmy, other soldiers rushed over. Sullivan was conscious, but barely. His body had burned every reserve it had. His core temperature had dropped dangerously low. Annalise knelt beside him. Without thinking, without questioning, she took off the wool coat he had given her hours ago. The coat that had kept her alive. She spread it over him like a blanket. Sullivan looked up at her through exhausted eyes. You are safe, he whispered. Told you we would make it. Then his eyes closed. Around them, the depot filled with people. Americans and Germans collapsed together. No more divisions, no more enemy lines, just humans who had survived hell together. Sergeant Martinez moved through the chaos, treating hypothermia cases without distinction. American, German, it did not matter. Just patients who needed help. Annalisa sat beside Sullivan's unconscious form, watching his chest rise and fall. This man had carried her for hours through conditions that should have killed them both. had risked his life because she reminded him of his sister, had proven every propaganda lie wrong through simple human decency. She looked around the depot, at Germans wrapped in American blankets, at Americans being tended by German hands, at Major Thornton making sure every person, regardless of uniform, had shelter and warmth. This was humanity. This was what they had tried to hide from her with their lies and propaganda and hate. Under the uniforms, beneath the nationalism, past all the labels and flags, they were all just people. People who wanted to live. People who could choose to help each other even when they had been taught to hate. The propaganda had told her Americans were monsters. But the propaganda had been wrong about everything. Out here in a Montana blizzard carried through hell by a man who saw his sister in her face, Annalise Schmidt finally learned the truth. And that truth would define the rest of her life. The storm raged for 48 hours. Outside the depot, the Montana wilderness became a frozen hell. Wind speeds peaked at 70 miles per hour. Temperature dropped to -38. Snow accumulated in drifts 15 feet high. The world beyond the walls was white death, pure and absolute. Inside, a different kind of transformation was taking place. The depot had been a mining supply facility decades earlier. Built to withstand the harshest Montana winters, it had thick stone walls and a heating system that still functioned. There were supplies here too, canned food left over from mining days, blankets and basic medical equipment, enough to keep everyone alive if they were careful. That first night, as the storm howled outside, the occupants collapsed wherever they could find space. American soldiers and German prisoners intermingled, too exhausted to maintain any pretense of separation. They lay in clusters on the concrete floor, sharing body heat, sharing blankets, sharing the profound relief of simply being alive. Annalise sat against a wall watching Sullivan sleep. He had been unconscious for 3 hours. Sergeant Martinez had checked him twice, pronounced him suffering from severe exhaustion and mild hypothermia, but fundamentally sound. He just needs rest, Martinez had said. His body spent everything it had out there. Annalise had stayed beside him the entire time. She did not question why, did not analyze the impulse. She simply stayed. Around her, the depot settled into uneasy quiet. People spoke in whispers, afraid to disturb those sleeping. The heating system hummed its steady rhythm. Outside, the wind screamed like something alive. Sullivan's eyes opened slowly. He looked confused for a moment, then his gaze found Annalise and he smiled weakly. "Hey, we made it." "Yes," Annalise said. "We made it because of you." Sullivan tried to sit up. His body protested and he winced. "Not just me. Everyone. We did it together. You carried me for so long," Annalise said. Why Sullivan thought about this carefully. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. "I need to tell you something, and I do not know why I need to tell you, but I do." Annalise waited. "My brother Sullivan," said. "Danny, he died at Normandy, German machine gun fire." Annalise felt ice form in her stomach. Sullivan continued, his eyes distant. "When they told me I would be guarding German prisoners, especially women, part of me was angry. Part of me wanted to hate all of you. Wanted to see you as the people who killed my brother." And now, Annalise whispered, "Now I understand something I did not before." Sullivan looked at her directly. "You did not kill Danny. The war killed him. The lies killed him. The men who started this whole nightmare, they killed him. You are just another victim, same as Danny, same as me, same as everyone here." He paused, gathering strength to finish. "I am telling you this because I want you to know that I chose to carry you even knowing about Danny. I chose to see you as human despite the pain, and I would make that choice again." Annalise felt tears coming, but did not try to stop them. "My brother too, Klaus. He died on the Eastern Front. I spent 2 years blaming everyone, blaming the Allies, blaming the enemies, never thinking maybe the people who sent him to die were the real enemies." They sat in silence for a moment. Two people who had lost brothers in this war, two people who had been taught to hate each other. Two people who had found something like understanding in the middle of frozen hell. "We are all just pawns," Sullivan said quietly. "Pieces in a game played by men who do not care if we live or die." "Yes," Annalise agreed, "but not anymore. Not after this. I will not be their pawn anymore," Good Sullivan said. Then he smiled, exhausted but genuine. "You're going to keep that coat because it looks better on you than it ever did on me." Annalise looked down at the wool coat she still wore. "Your coat. I should give it back." "No," Sullivan said firmly. "You keep it. So you never forget this day. So you always remember that people can choose kindness even when everything tells them to choose hate. Over the next 2 days, while the storm raged outside, the people inside the depot learned to coexist. Survival required cooperation. There was cooking to be done with limited supplies, injuries to treat, heat to maintain, water to melt from snow, tasks that required many hands working together. Language barriers broke down through necessity and gesture. An American soldier trying to explain something to a German woman would use his hands, his facial expressions, anything that communicated. The women responded in kind. Soon everyone had learned fragments of the other's language, enough to work together, enough to be human together. Sergeant Martinez taught several German women basic first aid. Annalise found herself working beside him, learning English medical terms, helping treat frostbite and hypothermia cases. She had good hands, Martinez observed, steady and careful. You could be a nurse, he told her through broken German and hand gestures. After the war, you have the gift for it. Maybe, Annalisa said. If there is an after, there will be, Martinez assured her. There will be. Helga, the strong farm woman, helped with cooking. She took their meager rations and somehow made them stretch further than seemed possible. The American soldiers were impressed. She could make a meal out of almost nothing. Where did you learn this? One soldier asked through a translator. Farm life, Helga said simply. You learn to waste nothing. You learn to make do. Young Margaret, who had been unconscious during the worst of the storm, woke on the second day. She was confused, frightened, but alive. Private Chen, who had carried her, checked on her constantly, made sure she ate, made sure she stayed warm. Why do you care? Margaret asked through one of the women who spoke better English. Chen thought about this. Because I almost lost you out there, he said. That makes you important to me. On the evening of the second day, Sullivan found Annalise near one of the small windows. She was watching snow fall past the glass, lost in thought. Can I sit? He asked. She nodded. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Sullivan spoke. What will you do when the war is over, when you go home? Annalise considered carefully. I will tell people about what happened here, about you, about the truth. Sullivan nodded. That is important, because people need to know. They need to understand that propaganda is just lies designed to make us hate each other. They will not want to hear it, Annalise said. In Germany, people will not want to know that the Americans were kind, that the enemy had honor. It contradicts everything they believe. I know, Sullivan said, but you tell them anyway. You keep telling them until they listen. Will you do the same? America. Yes, Sullivan said. I teach, or I want to, after the war, history, and I will tell them about this, about you, about choosing humanity over hate. Annalise smiled. Then maybe we change the world a little, one story at a time. Maybe, Sullivan agreed. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. This is my address, in Boston, where I will be after the war. Write to me. Let me know you are safe. Annalise took the paper like it was the most valuable thing in the world. I will. I promise. The third day the storm broke. The wind died. The snow stopped. The world outside became still and beautiful and terribly cold. Major Thornton organized the return to Camp Stronghold. The way back was easier. The storm had passed. They knew the route, and everyone was rested enough to walk or help others walk. But the dynamic had changed fundamentally. Guards and prisoners talked as they walked, helped each other over difficult terrain, shared food and water without being asked. The barriers between them had been eroded by shared survival. Back at the camp, the damaged barracks were repairable. Work began immediately, and without anyone organizing it, German prisoners worked alongside American soldiers, passing tools, holding boards, working together to rebuild what the storm had damaged. Lieutenant Morrison, who had opposed risking resources on prisoners, approached Major Thornton privately. Sir, I need to apologize for arguing, for questioning your decision. You were thinking of our men, Thornton said. That is not wrong, but you were thinking of all people, Morrison replied. That is better. You were right. About everything. I see that now. Thornton just nodded. War makes us forget our humanity sometimes. The important thing is we remembered when it mattered. March came. With it came news from Europe. The war was ending, Germany collapsing, Allied forces closing in from all sides. Berlin surrounded, Hitler's regime in its death throes. The news reached Camp Stronghold through radio reports. The American soldiers celebrated with quiet relief. It was almost over. They would go home soon. The German women received the news with complex emotions. Relief that the killing would stop, but also grief and fear. Their country was being destroyed. Their cities were rubble. Their families were in danger. Anneliese listened to reports about Hamburg being bombed and felt her stomach twist. Her mother. Was she alive? Was their house still standing? Was there anything left of the city she remembered? Sullivan found her crying in the barracks. Hamburg was hit again, she said. I do not know if my mother survived. Sullivan sat beside her, said nothing at first, just sat with her in her grief. Finally he spoke. I am sorry. I am sorry this war destroyed so much, hurt so many people. Everyone loses in war, Anneliese said. Everyone. Yes, Sullivan agreed. But maybe we can build something better after. Maybe all this suffering will teach us not to do it again. Anneliese wanted to believe that, wanted to think that humanity could learn from its mistakes. But she had seen how easily people believed lies, how readily they embraced hate when leaders told them to. I hope so, she said, but I am not certain. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrendered unconditionally. At Camp Stronghold, American soldiers celebrated, cautiously, respectfully aware that the German women were also hearing this news, aware that for them this was not purely joyful. Anneliese stood outside and looked at the Montana sky. The war was over. She had survived. Against all probability, against all expectation, she had survived. But what would she return to? What was left of Germany? What waited for her at home? That night there was a small gathering. Not quite a celebration, more an acknowledgement that something significant had ended. American soldiers and German prisoners sat together, shared what little food they had, spoke quietly about the future. Sullivan sat with Anneliese. You will be going home soon, he said. They will start repatriation now. Yes, Anneliese said. I suppose so. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the weight of impending separation heavy between them. Finally, Anneliese said, I will never forget what you did, what all of you did. You showed me what truth looks like. And you showed us something too, Sullivan said. Showed us that the enemy is just people, that propaganda only works if we let it. I will write, Anneliese promised. And I will write back, Sullivan said. The summer and fall of 1945 passed slowly. Repatriation was a complex process. Germany was in case. Infrastructure destroyed, government collapsed. Where would they send the prisoners? Who would receive them? But those months gave Anneliese and Sullivan time. Time to become real friends. Time to talk for hours about their lives, their families, their hopes for a world at peace. Sullivan taught Anneliese more English. She taught him better German. They talked about movies and music and books, about their childhoods and their dreams, about everything except the fact that soon they would be separated by an ocean and might never see each other again. November brought the final news. Repatriation would begin in December. The women would be sent to Frankfurt first, then dispersed to their home cities, or what was left of their home cities. 1 month, Sullivan said when Anneliese told him. We have 1 month, yes, Anneliese said. They spent that month deliberately, made sure to talk every day, made sure to say everything that needed saying, building memories that would have to last. On the last evening before departure, Sullivan gave Anneliese his wool blanket, the one he had given her during the blizzard, the one that had kept her alive. I cannot take this, Anneliese protested. It is yours, please, Sullivan insisted. I want you to have it, so you never forget that day, so you always remember that people can choose kindness. Anneliese took the blanket, held it against her chest. I could never forget. Never. Sullivan smiled. Good. And Annie, you are going to do great things, I know it. You are going to help rebuild your country the right way, with truth instead of lies. I will try, Anneliese said. For you, for everyone who showed me kindness. They hugged, not long, not dramatic, just a simple embrace between friends who had survived hell together. Take care of yourself, Sullivan said. You too, Anneliese replied. The next morning, trucks arrived to take the women to the processing center. Emotional farewells everywhere. Women hugging guards who had once terrified them. Guards giving small gifts, spare supplies, addresses scribbled on paper. Annalise boarded the truck with Sullivan's blanket folded carefully in her arms. She waved as the truck pulled away. Watch Sullivan standing in the Montana landscape until distance made him invisible. January 1946. Annalise arrived in Hamburg. The train journey across Germany had been devastating. Every city showed scars of war. Buildings collapsed, infrastructure destroyed, people hollow-eyed and desperate. But Hamburg was worst of all. Her city was barely recognizable. Entire neighborhoods simply gone, reduced to rubble and ash. The bombing campaign had been merciless. She found her mother living in the basement of what had been their apartment building. The building itself was a gutted shell, but the basement had survived, and her mother had survived. The reunion was tearful. Her mother held her and wept and thanked God and did not let go for long minutes. That first night, huddled in the basement with a small fire for warmth, Annalise told her mother about Montana, about the blizzard, about the American soldiers who had carried German prisoners through a storm that should have killed them all. Her mother listened with disbelief at first, then confusion, then slowly, painfully acceptance. So everything they told us, her mother said finally. It was lies, not everything, Annalise said. But the important things, the things about the enemy, those were lies. Her mother laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound. They destroyed our country with their lies. And we let them. We believed every word. We did not know, Annalisa said. They controlled everything we heard, everything we saw. But you know now, her mother said. You know the truth. Yes, Annalisa said. And I am going to make sure other people know it too. And that is exactly what she did. 1946 through 1949. Germany slowly rebuilt under Allied occupation. Cities rose from rubble. Infrastructure was restored. Democratic government took hesitant shape. Annalise found work as a translator for the occupation forces. Her English, learned from Sullivan and refined over months, made her valuable. But more important was her mission. She spoke wherever people would listen. Youth groups, church gatherings, community meetings. She told them about the blizzard, about American soldiers risking their lives to save German prisoners, about how propaganda had lied to everyone. The reception was mixed. Many Germans did not want to hear it. Some still believed the propaganda. Others were ashamed and wanted to forget. Some accused her of betraying Germany by praising the enemy. But young people listened. Those who had been children during the war. Those who wanted to understand how their country had been deceived. Those who wanted to build something better. Slowly, painfully, she found an audience. Through these years, letters went back and forth across the Atlantic. Sullivan wrote from Boston about his life after military service, about attending college on the GI Bill, about studying to become a teacher, about meeting a woman named Patricia who would become his wife. Annalise wrote back about her work in Germany, about the speaking engagements, about the resistance and the small victories, about her determination to keep telling the truth no matter how many people did not want to hear it. The letters kept them connected, kept the memory of that blizzard alive, reminded both of them that they had witnessed something important, something that proved humanity could triumph over hate. 1962. Annalise was 39 years old. She had become a teacher specializing in history. She taught at a school in Hamburg, in a building reconstructed from bombing ruins. In her classroom, she kept Sullivan's wool blanket, folded carefully on a shelf where students could see it. What is that, they would ask, and she would tell them. The whole story, the blizzard, the American soldiers, the lies of propaganda, and the truth of human kindness. The students would listen with wide eyes. This was history that felt real. Not dates and battles, but human stories. Stories about choices, about courage, about seeing through lies to truth. This is why we study history, Annalisa would tell them. Not to memorize facts, but to learn that we always have a choice. We can believe the lies and hate the other, or we can choose to see the humanity in everyone. Which will you choose, she would ask them. And most of them, not all, but most, would choose humanity. 1975. Annalise was 52 years old. A new war museum opened in Berlin. They contacted her about her story, about the blanket. At first she hesitated. The blanket was personal, her connection to Sullivan, her reminder of the day her life changed. But then she realized, this was how truth spreads. This was how the story reaches beyond her classroom, beyond her lifetime. The museum ceremony that summer drew press coverage. Cameras, reporters, questions. Annalise stood before them with the blanket in her hands and spoke. "I have kept this blanket for 30 years. It has been my proof that what happened was real. But now I give it to you, to Germany, to the world. So you can remember too." She held up the faded wool. "This blanket represents a truth we must never forget, that our common humanity is stronger than any propaganda, that people can choose kindness even when everything tells them to choose hate. An American soldier gave me this blanket so I would live. He carried me through hell because he saw me as human. Not as an enemy, just as a person who needed help." Her voice caught with emotion. "And in doing so, he saved more than my life. He saved my soul from the lies I had been taught." The blanket went on display, behind protective glass, with the full story explained in detail. Thousands visited, read the story, felt the power of it, learned that propaganda could be defeated by simple human decency. 1976. Summer, the museum received unexpected visitors. James Sullivan, now 55 and gray-haired, arrived with his wife, Patricia. They had traveled to Germany specifically to see the museum, to see the blanket. Sullivan stood in front of the display for a long time, his old coat behind glass, the story he had lived now preserved for others to learn from. Museum staff noticed him, overheard him talking to his wife about that day, about carrying a young German woman named Annalise through a Montana blizzard. They realized who he was, called Annalise immediately. She came, dropped everything and ran to the museum. 31 years after the blizzard, they saw each other again. "Jimmy," she said, her voice breaking. "Annie," he replied. They embraced, wept, held each other while museum visitors watched and journalists scrambled for cameras. For an hour they stood together, looked at the blanket, answered questions. Told the story again together, this time filling in details the other had forgotten. "Why did you do it?" a reporter asked Sullivan. "Why carry an enemy through a blizzard?" Sullivan's answer was simple. "She was not my enemy. She was a person who needed help. And I was someone who could help. That is all that mattered." Another reporter turned to Annalise. "What would you say to young people today about propaganda?" Annalise looked at the blanket, at Sullivan standing beside her, at the crowd gathered to hear their story. "I would say this: question everything your government tells you about the other. The moment they tell you someone is less than human, that is when you know they are lying. Because we are all human, all of us, and humanity recognizes no borders." The years passed. Annalise continued teaching, continued speaking. Her hair went white, her face lined with age. But her voice remained strong, her message remained clear. Question the lies. Choose humanity. Remember that kindness defeats hate. 1998. Annalise was 75 years old. A young journalist came to interview her for a documentary about World War II survivors. "Why have you spent your whole life telling this one story?" the journalist asked. Annalisa thought carefully before answering. "Because that one day showed me what we are capable of, both the worst and the best of humanity. The worst is propaganda that makes us hate people we have never met. Systems that send young people to kill each other for lies." She paused. "And the best is a man who carried an enemy through a blizzard because he refused to let propaganda make him cruel. That day taught me we always have a choice. We can believe the lies and hate, or we can choose to carry each other through the storm. I have spent my life telling this story because I want people to make the right choice, to choose humanity every single time." "And do you think people listen?" the journalist asked. "Some do," Annalise said. "Some do not. But I will keep telling it as long as I can, because that is what I promised. That is what I owe to the man who saved my life." Annalisa Schmidt passed away in 1999. She was 76 years old. She had spent 54 years telling the story of the blizzard. James Sullivan passed away in 2002. He was 81. He remained her lifelong friend and correspondent until the end. The wool blanket remains in the Berlin War Museum today, behind glass, with the full story preserved in multiple languages. Thousands see it every year. They read about a Montana blizzard in 1945, about American soldiers who carried German prisoners through hell, about a young woman named Annalisa who learned that propaganda dies when you look into the eyes of someone carrying you to safety. They read about choices, about humanity, about truth defeating lies. And some of them, not all but some, carry that lesson with them. Choose kindness in their own lives. Question the propaganda they are told. See the humanity in everyone, even those they are told to hate. This is the legacy. This is what endures. Not the blanket itself, though it remains as evidence. Not even the specific details of one storm in one place at one time. What endures is the truth at the heart of it all, that we are all human, that we can choose compassion over cruelty, that kindness is stronger than hate, that propaganda is defeated not by counter-propaganda, but by simple human decency, that when we carry each other through the storms of life, we become more than what we were taught to be. We become what we were meant to be all along, simply human, gloriously, courageously, defiantly human. And no lie, no matter how often repeated, can ever defeat that truth. This is the story of the blizzard. This is the story of Annalisa Schmidt and James Sullivan. This is the story of 87 German women and 150 American soldiers who proved that humanity survives even in the darkest times. This is the story that must never be forgotten, because in a world still full of propaganda and division, we need this reminder more than ever. We need to remember that the enemy is never the person wearing a different uniform. The enemy is the lie that tells us they are less human than we are. We need to remember that real courage is not about fighting enemies. Real courage is about carrying them when they cannot walk, about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier, about seeing humanity even when everything tells us to see only hate. This is what America means at its best. Not perfect, not without flaws, but striving always to do what is right, to see dignity in all people, to carry each other through the storms. This is the truth that Annalisa Schmidt spent her life teaching. This is the truth that James Sullivan proved with his actions. This is the truth that endures. May we never forget it. May we live it in our own lives. May we pass it to the next generation. Because some truths are too important to lose. Some acts of compassion echo through time. Some choices define what it means to be human. And the choice to carry an enemy through a blizzard, to give them your coat and your warmth and your strength, to see their humanity when everything tells you to see only an enemy, that choice matters. That choice changed 87 lives in 1945. And if we let it, that choice can change the world today. All we have to do is remember. All we have to do is choose humanity. All we have to do is carry each other through the storm.